Alrighty, so it is 6 o'clock. So thank you to everyone for attending tonight's connected conversation. Here with me, I have Gabrielle Davis and Dr. Cheryl Ostreicher. Did I say her name right?
A striker. It was
Okay.
close.
I,
Yeah,
I always try, and every time I fail.
it's all right.
Um, but yeah, if you guys have any questions throughout this, use the Q&A feature. It's located at the bottom of your guys' screen. And then yeah, if you guys want to take it away, floor is all yours.
Sure. So I'm Cheryl. I'm head of special collections and archives at Boise State University in the library. And I'm here kind of to talk about some of the things we have documented in our collections and the history, people, organizations, activities, etc., that give an overview for the past 30-ish, 40-ish years.
My name is Gabrielle. I'm sorry, Cheryl, was your mouth opened again? Were you about to say
Nope,
something else?
I'm good.
Okay. Zoom. My name is Gabrielle Davis. Most people call me Gabby. I am a respiratory therapist. Is my full-time paid job here. I also run Youth Alliance for Diversity, which is the oldest and longest running LGBT youth group in Idaho, in Boise. And it meets from once a week for 2 hours for kids 12 to 20. It's not meeting right now. I am not from Idaho. I've been here 4 long years. So when this topic came up, and the three of us were just talking about this too as well, and Cheryl and I have talked about it previous. It's interesting because the history I know about in Idaho compared to the history I know about from the states I've lived in, which have been Michigan and Illinois, are different. And so more of my Idaho history is what I've learned from queer elders and the youth that's been living here all of their lives.
Yeah,
I'm also married. I like long walks on the beach. Um, I came to Idaho because I hate awkward silence, if you can tell, but I came to Idaho because my wife took a job here. So that's why I'm here.
And also, I guess I should do a little background about myself, since after all these conversations, I have yet to talk about myself. I'm also from DC, and I've also lived here for 4 years, just like Gabrielle. So we have kind of similar backgrounds with learning the history from people that have been here rather than experiencing some of it firsthand.
And I should add to that too, because I've lived here for 8 years. And so I've lived in several other states in various regions of the country. And I've learned it just from working with our collections, questions people ask, being involved in different areas, and just wanting to know what it's all about. One of the things that I do is work to document the history of Boise, the region, area, Boise State University, and more or less Idaho as well. And within that, we really try to find collections that are representative and have different perspectives, views, and all kinds of things. So for our LGBTQ collections, we have a lot of newspapers and collections from people, organizations about early Boise Gay Pride parades and Pride Fest. We have, activists who are in there, politicians, places like the community center, organizations like Your Family, Friends, and Neighbors, and all kinds of things. And I must give credit to my predecessor, Alan Verda, who started all of these collecting these groups of records, because he made great strides, and I've tried to continue that to make sure that anyone who's interested can be informed about our history. And of course, anyone, not at the moment, unfortunately, but under normal circumstances, anyone can come in and look at our collections. And what we do too is try to use them in coursework and present it to students so that people who haven't lived here for a long time or are unfamiliar can do that. So we have also some information about organizations and student groups at Boise State throughout history, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And I think, I've just learned so much and I'm still learning. Anytime I look at a collection, a paper, report, talk to somebody, I learn more. And that's one of the things that I like. We have, and we have a lot from like the late 80s into the 90s, and then some past that too. But when the groups were really becoming active and, and it dates back further than that, but I always kind of go back to when the first Boise Pride Parade in 1989 and Pride Fest in 1990, and how all of that started making everything more visible and engaging people. We have a lot of information about Proposition 1, which was the anti-gay legislation that uh, the Idaho Citizens Alliance, is that right? Idaho Citizens Alliance presented in, I believe it started in 94. It went on for a couple of years, and how both sides, reacted, why they did it, who was involved, how it was stopped, and so forth, as well as just, things like the Elm Awards, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And there's a lot of rich history that reflects just what goes on in Boise and what Boise is trying to be, as a city, as a community, and everything. One of our really great collections is of oral histories that a former faculty, Riley Caldwell O'Keefe, did in a class. She had her students interview someone in Idaho, it could be anyone in Idaho, uh, uh, about their experiences as part of the LGBTQ community. And, there's good things. There's things talking about the founding of the balcony and the great people that they met, but there's not great things about the harassment and anti-gay sentiments that they experienced, and all kinds of things. And, being left out of their families because of who they were, and all kinds of things. And so it's, it's the kind of history that has some really great triumphs but also some really awful tragedies. And, but it definitely reflects, uh, you know, there's a lot of progress that has been made. There's of course still more to do, but there, when working with students, especially, and a few years ago when gay marriage was finally legalized, I would bring some of these things out to talk about, here's how we got to where we are today. It's not about, this didn't just happen. There's a lot of history that goes into it, and a lot of work from so many people that helped contribute to these triumphs. And yeah, that's kind of the nutshell version.
And I'll kind of piggyback on some of the things that Cheryl said. In complete transparency, I had no idea about this project that Cheryl was doing until Cheryl and I had a conversation. And it's true that not only do I've taught a class at Boise State, but I live on a Boise State campus too. So I've never heard of it until Cheryl and I met. And I think the importance of the project Cheryl is mentioning for me as a queer person is a reminder that history can repeat itself. And it is just like when we think about American history and the things that are happening with race right now. These are things that have happened already that are rehappening, or are continuing to happening, although most of America has forgotten it happened. So in that aspect, I think that the oral histories and what Boise State has done by collecting all these papers and artifacts. I don't know if Cheryl, if you mentioned some of the artifacts that they've collected from different marches, and all the work has been done, is more important, I think, for well-meaning cisgender heterosexual people. For me, coming here as a queer person, it was more important for me to go talk to these people because they are still alive in Boise. It's also important to me to use the privilege I have to include them when we're talking about them, or talking about work they've participated in, and work that needs to be done, and work that's happening right now. So, the people that, when we talk about, queer history, in Idaho, it's important to know that a lot of those main players and activists and advocates that did a lot of this work are still alive, living right here in Idaho. The youth group I work for or I volunteer with was ran by the same person since 1994. Oh, God, I hope I got that right. I'm gonna go with 1999 because if I get this date wrong and he hears this, and it's 1999, and the youth group was initially called Family, Friends, and Neighbor, like Cheryl mentioned, and it didn't start as a youth group. It started with youth wanting to help with what was going on with Proposition 1. And then once that was over, they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have anything else to do. And so that's how the youth group came from kids wanting to, or youth wanting to be together and make change. And that was turned into something else. But, you know, the youth group living within a project of TCC has followed TCC in all their physical moves and has provided a safe space for queer and trans people across Idaho. We've had people drive from Oregon. We've had parents bring their kids from hours away just for 2 hours, and then they go back to whatever rural city they came from in Idaho. So I think it's important that we know this history. I think it's important that cisgender heterosexual people use this information to do some work themselves instead of relying on queer people to do emotional labor for them for free. And I think it's a good thing for youth to have when we start doing it, because these are what we're talking about now will be projects in school for people. Some of my mentees did projects about LGBT history in Idaho. So I think it's good that we have that. But we also still have active members, both older and younger, still out doing this work, still pushing towards these things. And this history that we're talking about, again, it's happening currently. And a prime example is what's happening with the law that was passed to ban trans women from playing sports. So it's important to know where some of those things came from, the damage that was done and will be done again. So there's that.
Well, yeah, and even to add to that, because what we think of as current right now is history in the future. So history never ends. You just keep adding to it, and that's part of it too. Anyone who participates is part of history and is making it happen. Anything that anyone does for any of it's part of history. And one of the questions I get as an archivist over the years is, oh, but I'm not famous, no one is going to be interested in what I did. And that is so not true. It's the people on the ground and out there and working tirelessly, and that's what we have in some of our collections. And I see there's a couple of questions. Can I go ahead and answer?
Oh, go for it.
Okay. To my knowledge, and if anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the first gay bar in Boise was the Balcony, and I don't know what year it was founded, but I'd be happy to figure that out and get back to you. And then, yes, there was a newspaper put out by the community center that has gone through several names. And I think it was at first just called the community center or the community paper. I would have to double check, but it started back probably in late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And so, and I don't know that we have all of them, but we have a lot of them. And it is really interesting to look back at those to see, here's what the issues that they were dealing with at that time, what has changed, what hasn't changed, and to look at all that. But I always think of archives as preservers of the past, present, and future, because, what we do never ends. And it's always important to make sure that we can keep those records for future generations.
And then I actually have a question. So Idaho, at least I would argue, is a pretty isolated state geographically. I mean, the population is dispersed over a wide area, and Boise is considered by some to be one of the most isolated cities geographically as well. So how much do you think Idaho's isolation as a state played into the LGBTQ history that played out in Boise and across the state?
I think a lot. And I think that that extends to just about any topic you could possibly imagine. And uh, I've lived in major cities, I've lived in suburbs, I've lived in, smaller cities in a wide variety of places. And it really, there is somewhat of a disconnect, and it's both that sometimes people don't pay attention to Idaho, and Idaho is often forgotten in the narratives of any history, except for maybe, random moments. And I think that makes it harder for Idahoans to find those resources and find out that history. And, except for the Boise area, everyone is so spread out. So there's that. With these oral histories, some of the students interviewed people that lived in other towns. And so comparing their experiences to people in Boise is really interesting because it's very different. And yeah, I think it plays into that. But now, as we become more connected through internet, social media, etc., there's a lot more opportunities to overcome that too.
I think that being an isolated city plays into it. I think lack of funding for resources plays a big part into it because, again, the states I lived in weren't rural. The cities I lived in weren't rural in the state, but we had a lot of funding that came from state and local government. Idaho is not a very inclusive state to provide that funding. I think the other news that comes along with Idaho, and again, this is as an outsider because, to be honest, I didn't find Idaho was a state until I had to move here. I'm like, what state is Idaho in when I was moving here? I think that, a lot of things you hear about, the first thing you hear about Idaho, if you Google it, depending on where you Google from, because that matters, is you hear about the Aryan Nation. So, just knowing that there's type hate groups, it doesn't matter what type, is another reason not to feel safe to live authentically. So I think there are a lot of queer people out looking for each other, and it proves it to see how many people I have at the youth group from different rural areas of Idaho, or people that get to come to events like Pride and the prom and all these other things that pay for hotel rooms to do that would likely do it in their own city if there was an ability to do it. If there was a physical space that safety could be guaranteed, they would participate.
And I'm sorry, as I'm looking at the chat, I see that I have been corrected. And so Gwen, thank you. And please thank Dean for me. That Shucky's Tavern opened in 1975 and was the first gay bar in Boise. And I have heard about Emerald's, and I don't know when that one opened. And I know it closed several years ago. And I don't know about the Wizard. That's a new one for me. So I have to go look that up. But yeah, thank you. Because, this is part of it, is that, none of us know everything about it. And we're always learning. To answer Tracy's question about where to go to read more about LGBTQ history in Idaho, that's one of the things that's kind of unfortunate, is I don't think there is a lot of scholarship that really does that. There's the book Boys of Boise, which is about the so-called homosexuality scandal in 1955, where gay men were interviewed, arrested, persecuted for having relations with other men. And this was back in the context of when people believed homosexuality was a mental illness. And, it was all men too, and everything. And that book came out in the 60s. And Boise did get some notoriety from that incident in the 50s, and it had made some national news, but it was also reflective of what was going on in a lot of cities at the time. And because it was an underground culture and lifestyle.
And that's very, very common in a lot of states. I think a lot longer in Idaho because of the history of the state. Also, even now is a lot of, people living unauthentically, again, because physical safety, and the ability to have access to basic needs are a higher priority than living authentically. Another, if you want resources about history specifically or just things about the LGBT community, the community center has a bookstore, not a bookstore, a library. And they have all the books are either about queer people or written by queer people. And not only that, there is one of the, oh, he gonna hear, I'm gonna say elder, he's gonna hate that. But there is a person that has been doing this work in Idaho since the 80s, who is there every Saturday between 10 to 12 if you ever want to have a conversation. So any of my questions about history, that was the person I went to learn things and to find resources. His name is Javier Smith, and he's a wealth of knowledge about Idaho history.
Yeah, and I think to accentuate one of the things you said, it's talking to people too, because you can only learn so much from books, but it's learning directly from people or from records or whatever way that you actually get the fuller experience, and potentially
seek out.
Yeah,
There are people willing to have these conversations, not only people from history, and there are people currently out doing this work, trying to help people learn. There are folks for that. There are people that can be compensated, because oftentimes queer people are asked to talk about their experiences for free or to help educate people on how not to be homophobic or transphobic for free. And the expectation is that since it's bad, we should want to do it for free. When emotional labor is something, it's just like money. You only can spend it if you got it. So there are people in the community doing this work. Yeah, I'm not a person that's starstruck. Like I've, met famous people and I don't have a reaction, but the people I've met here that have been here to meet somebody who was an activist and to have coffee with them and just have a conversation. And I was new when this first started happening. I just reached out like, hey, let's chat. And they were happy about it, to be acknowledged and to be able to share their story and to have somebody listen to understand versus listening to respond is a big deal and can have a positive impact on you and the person you're talking to.
And Gabrielle, do you actually mind talking more about the community center, such like where it is, and then also what services are available at the community center?
Well, right now, no services because of
Yeah.
COVID, darn COVID. But
Yeah.
the community center is at 1088 Orchard. It's in Boise, and it hosts a lot of different groups, predominantly queer, pertaining to queer people or queer well-being. They have a resource center, so a lot of people come in to find resources for counseling. We only have a select few counselors. We put up counselors or mental health clinicians, and those counselors have been suggested by people who've used them versus the counselors suggesting themselves, like I'm affirming. So that's one place. We have a food pantry. They just expanded that. So if people who are in need can go there and get food items when we have food. The youth group meets there. Or a number of different groups can meet there, but it's open to the community for different events. The website has a public calendar, so you can use it that way. The community center is all ran on donations. We don't get any funding at all from the government. So we stay open month to month with donations from the community. The libraries is a big thing. All the books have been donated. Sometimes there are giveaways when we get double copies. They'll give away some of the books there, and it's all volunteer ran. There's no paid employees. Everything is based on volunteers. And they have a MCC. They have an inclusive church that's ran at TCC. It's Metropolitan Community Church, I believe. Somebody can correct me in the comments if you like, because I've always called it MCC. And they're a very inclusive group too. So they have services on Sundays and on holidays. They, provide meals for the community. Yeah, it's very hard to sum up the community center because it changes as the community needs it to change. So.
No, and I think that's definitely a great resource that Boise has.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just nice to hear that there's so many different services available there. Um,
Mhm.
we have another question that just came in. So it's geared towards Cheryl.
Mhm.
Given Idaho's um, recent stance towards various issues, have you had any pushback with your oral history project or collecting any materials for like minority groups or other um, groups similar that have been marginalized?
Uh, Not exactly. Like, no, I think, it's not everyone knows what we have, so they don't know to
Mhm.
push back on it. However, the oral histories have been publicly available online for, I was going to look this up, 4 years maybe. And everyone who participated knew they were going to be online, signed agreements and everything. But unfortunately, some of those people experienced harassment because of that. So we had to redact the names of some of the people. And because, our goal is not to encourage any of that. Our goal is to help people learn and educate. And there are some unfortunate experiences, and I I can't speak to all the details, but I know other things have happened across campus as well, and of course in the community too. And that, but it's, no one has come out and said you can't collect anything like that. And we do try to, this is what archives in general try to do in a lot of places, is collect the voices of underrepresented groups, because for so many centuries really it was about dead white men, as we affectionately call people. And women, blacks, LGBTQ, Latino, Asian, and name any group. And Jewish, along religion, race, ethnicity, anything. And a lot, all these marginalized groups, it's very important to recognize their voices and preserve it, because everyone is part of the conversation and needs to be involved in that and deserves to have their history documented permanently, forever. um, we have a large collection about our Japanese internment camp at Minidoka, and we use that and talk about the racism that occurred because of that. And so it goes on, and all of these are so interconnected, because really it's all about human rights. And that's that. But yeah, I
That's that intersectionality piece that
mhm,
we tend as humans leave out the conversation. When we talked about like all of the clubs and the balcony and history of the balcony and how monumental it was when because we had the balcony, have the balcony and all those things. What that isn't that is the opinion of the majority. But when you are somebody with intersecting identity, so for me, I'm obviously a black person, can't take that off at night, can't hide it. Um, and I'm a queer person, so I could go to the balcony and feel affirmed in my queer identity, but may experience racism because again, intersecting marginalized identities, that's how it is. Or uh, similar things happen with, another example I can use is being a black queer person and going into a black church here, which is, it's only a couple. I could be affirmed in my blackness, but will I be shunned for being queer? So we have all these things, just like you said, are interconnected based on human rights and judgment and ignorance, willful ignorance specifically, that come into play when we talk about these different groups of people.
and yeah, to add to that too, the history, it does repeat itself. And that's something that we want to, the more people learn, are educated, are aware of that history, the less likely, we
Yeah.
hope, is, it is repeated.
Mhm. And that's a good. I mean, that thought is good, and we know that the work involved in it can't only be with queer people. We know that the work involved can't only be with um, with black people or any marginalized group. That it takes the work of of everyone to help. And we do that by, participating in allyship.
And then, are there any Idaho women whose experiences have been recorded and documented that are predominant within the history of Idaho?
Uh, some of the oral histories that I mentioned, there are some women that are in there. And, that's one thing that when you look at the collections we have at Boise State, it's predominantly white. And I've never done the percentages. I've been kind of interested in this of like male, female, and all the different kinds of things that we could analyze them but I, definitely have been trying to bring more female voices into our collections. And, one collection that we have that I think is, one of the more recent LGBTQ collections we've acquired, although we've had it for a while, is Nicole Favor. So the first openly gay Idaho legislator. And, and she's not done working either. So we'll get more and, some of that. And so it's also interesting because part of it is what work she did before that led into how she did her work with environmental activism, LGBTQ issues, and all kinds of things. And so, and then you take her and others and you place them within the context. We have a few other female politicians. So what did they do in previous generations and how did it change? So it's always good to look at that, but there's just a lot of voices that are still missing that we do what we can and we try, but it kind of never ends.
Mm-hmm. And then, do the other universities also have archives or collections with a focus on the LGBTQ communities, or is it mainly focused within Boise as the capital?
That's a good question, and I actually don't know the answer. I think I'd be happy to find out, but I am not sure. One thing that archives do is we try to put at least information about our collections on websites and everything. So there's ways you could possibly look. I also am not quite sure what the Idaho State Archives might have and other places, and this is one of the things that archives do too, is that there's a lot of hidden history in other collections. And so we have some that are absolutely your family, friends, and neighbors, Nicole, Community Center, all of these that are clearly about LGBTQ issues. But then you have other collections that might have some of that in there, but unless we highlight it and make it well known, it's sometimes hard to find that. And, we have a lot of politicians' papers. And so depending on what years those covered, there might be some things about legislation in there. And, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do too, is uncover those things that are hidden so that we can bring them and then actually, make them more usable and accessible. But it also takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy that's your job, Cheryl, and not mine. Okay.
Yeah,
None of it sounds fun for me.
I know it is. It takes a lot, but it's a lot of fun. And for me, it's because one of my favorite things about being an archivist is that I learn something every day. Whether I'm looking at a new collection, someone asks a question, whatever it might be, and that is just invaluable to me.
And then another thing for the participants who are curious, we have an attendee that recommended the Latah County Historical Society. They might have an oral history collection, or just checking in with your local county historical societies. They might have more specific records or histories for whatever county you're interested in.
If I can add to that, I know University of Idaho has a bunch of Latah County oral histories that has amazing search capabilities and across all kinds of topics. It's a really fantastic collection. I use it as a model. So.
And then one thing that I'm personally really curious in, so there's a little selfish question, but what would you say would be like the hallmark moments in LGBTQ history within Boise for both of you, since history is experienced depending on the person.
Mm. Hallmark usually denotes something good.
Or call out moments, I should say then.
I would say the anti-trans athlete bill that was just passed. A lot of people, queer folks, are pretty upset, specifically trans folks, because there's a lot of discrimination within the LGBT community against trans folks. It was pretty disheartening, but my initial reaction was not shock. It was not shock, and I think that I had some anger, and my anger was, yes, we know the bill was created to intentionally harm trans people. It's very clear why the bill was made. However, nobody looked at the other impacts, which is interesting because both Idaho government, U.S. government, seem to be pro-economics versus people right now. And as we see in the recent weeks, the things that has come from passing that bill. So, the money that comes into Idaho for sports is astronomical. And so while there's things from the government about, Boise State participating in diversity inclusion things and initiatives, and states should be paying that, blah, 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 blah. But big organizations like the NCAA has rules involving inclusion and equity. If they are not allowing athletes to come here or to have to play here, whatever comes of this, yes, the schools are losing out on money and the athletes are losing out on opportunities, but so are the small businesses that benefit from all these people coming in. And people coming in from within Idaho, coming to these games at ISU and Boise State and all these things. So we're losing out economically as well. Furthermore, what bothered me is that the likelihood that the people that voted read the actual bill is slim, that read through all the things. Because the trans athlete bill will likely harm more cisgender girls than trans girls. And that's because kids can be catty. So one of the things in the bill stated that if somebody was accused of being trans, or another word that didn't go there, because the language was also pretty off. Accuse somebody of being trans, or they were found to be trans, they had to have a physical exam. Now, if let's say Doug and I are both young ladies and we play basketball together and we're in 10th grade, I was a horrible child. Kids are cruel. So what happened if I accuse Doug of being a trans girl? Does Doug now have to get a physical exam to look at their genitalia to determine that? And I might know that Doug isn't a trans girl, but because I'm petty, because I'm a child, that might be the case. So it's likely to hurt more cisgender girls than trans girls attempting to play sports. So I think it was really sad to know that nobody read, that's the first thing I'm like, so nobody's reading bills in entirety. And for Idaho to be such a state focused on economics and ability for Idahoans to make money and prosper financially, the amount of money they're losing just from sports now. And now people with state-funded travel from California, Idaho is banned. They won't pay. So, I know Idaho doesn't like Californians. It seems to be the thing. Because first thing they ask, like, where are you from? So yes, less Californians will be coming. Well, will be coming here for work, which again, and Idaho is likely benefiting from that work. So it's no travel. They've banned state travel from California to come here. So it's interesting to see what other states do that too. So we're losing economically in order to hurt the few trans people that want to play sports.
Yeah, I know. I think that's the thing, is that there's, from what I know about our history going back, it's that there's so many moments, good and bad, but they all build on each other and relate to each other, that it's hard to pick
One singular
always just
event.
one, because it's, what Pride Fest started as was sort of this, small gathering where it was sort of public, but not quite public. And it was a group of people they had been getting, before the festival kind of started, they had been getting together and meeting and stuff before that anyway. And then, made it more public, and which was great. And then that led into the things like Proposition 1, because suddenly, if you keep it hidden, then no one cares quite as much sometimes because it's not visible. But then suddenly everything was more visible, so then all this legislation started happening. And it wasn't just in Idaho, like Proposition 1, that was happening across the country in several states. And that was defeated. And then it led into, we're going to work towards this. And then, so it's like always forward and then a little bit back, hopefully keeping moving, but it's all so related. It's hard to take, as a historian, it's hard to take just one part and think about that. But I think, with that bill, I just, with things like, gay marriage being legalized, and the recent Supreme Court decision with including rights for the LGBTQ community in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then how is that going to fit in? How is that going to affect it, going forward? And so it's all, but I think, we just keep working.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that as well. It is hard to isolate one moment, especially with a lot of the recent legislation that has been passed both on a state level but also at the federal level. Do you mind talking more about the Boise Boys? Because I've actually never heard of that. So
Sure. It was so it was basically, there are a lot of factors in this, and and this was going on across the country too in the 50s. And depending on the perspective you look at it, some people say that they were going after like this gay billionaire to try to get, you can't be part of this elite club, as we're and everything. But others have also argued it was part of Cold War politics, because part of the Cold War and was presenting, if you think of the 1950s, it's the white picket fence, the two cars, living in the suburbs, the nuclear family. And part of that was, part of it was just a lot of people were like that, but part of it was, this is what the US wanted to present to the world as, we are this amazing and perfect kind of place. And so anything that didn't fit within that ideal was considered, bad, wrong, thinking of, all those Hollywood people that were accused of communism and excommunicated from the industry. And so, this was one of those things, but it was also, again, when homosexuality was considered a mental illness and thought it was bad. People were accused of having relations with underage boys. And it was all about men, so the women weren't part of this, at least that I know of. And people were interviewed. Some people were arrested. Some got prison sentences. If you go to the old pen, they have some information too about some of those prisoners. But, it was conduct like lewd behavior and those kinds of things. And it made national news at the time and lasted a couple of years. By the time they did that, they interviewed, I guess, close to 1,500 people. And, and things that I've read too, it's like, it's kind of murky about how it really got started and how it really ended. And it was, it was kind of, and I do think that while there were people who, wanted to put a stop to this, untoward behavior, it was also an embarrassment for Boise. You know, people don't really, and that's where some of the history gets hidden too, is that people don't want to talk about it because they're embarrassed or ashamed. And some of it is that, you know, or that it was just too traumatic too. You know, there's all those different things. So it's kind of this just weird event, and it was pretty isolated. Like,
Okay.
I don't know if any, you know, it lasted these couple of years in the 50s, and then I don't know if anything else like that happened after or not. And it still pops up in history books and stuff here and there too. And if I can answer the question about Boys of Boise mentions any people by name, I actually don't know if any of those people went on to write anything. I'm not positive. It's I'd have to look. That's a really interesting question, and I can't say. All I can say is that there, to my knowledge, there are not a lot of records about it. You know, mostly what occurred in the Idaho, or was published in the Idaho Statesman, and you know, I'm sure that there's some legal documents out there, but there's not a lot else about it. So it's still kind of unclear all the different facets of it. But you know, yeah.
And then where do both of you see living in Idaho 10 years from now and like being queer? What do you see life like?
You know, well, let me just say, I'll preface this by my intention is not to be in Idaho in 10 years living because of safety, because of the safety factor now and, you know, the wait period in between. I am thankful for Generation Z right now because they are doing the most work for inclusion and equity right now. It's not people my age, it's not people before me, it's not boomers at all. But the young folks that's doing this work right now, I think they have the passion and the collective power to make change. So I think at some point, hopefully in my lifetime, that Boise will be a safer place to live as a queer person. For me, I think that a lot of queer people do feel safe here, and I don't want that to be taken lightly. But for me to be a queer person and have another marginalized identity, I don't feel it's a safe place to live. Um, but eventually, I think, you know, they said Boise is one of the um, something about most people are moving here. I can't remember
Yeah, the
the
most
number
livable
one
city.
most livable city, and I'm wondering who the people were that they polling. I bet it was cisgender straight white people that they polled for that. Livable, you know, the cost of living is low, but you don't have some of the services like transit and things like that that you need to get around. Um, but until it's one of the most inclusive cities or equitable cities to live in, I don't think it'll be the safest place for queer people to be, unless you have money. Money is always the guiding principle when it comes to safety.
Yeah. What I hope for, because I, of course, wish I could make that kind of prediction, is that as different generations grow up, they don't notice all of the differences in the same way, and that it's I don't know how to I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but you know, it's like, so you know, there will be a generation who will never know that gay marriage was outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different kinds of things and like with the youth, I think that because, you know, a lot of reactions to it is fear, and it's fear of the unknown and not understanding and not being aware of whatever it might be. And so I think as it's more in the as it's just discussed more and everything, and that hopefully some of that can be overcome, you know, it will always be, it will never completely go away, because that's just not, unfortunately, how the world works. But I think it'll be interesting. And I think too that if Boise's population continues to grow at the rate that it is, which is, I don't know if it's slowed down now since um, COVID, but bigger cities have more of those resources. And so if Boise continues to grow, hopefully those kinds of resources and communities, groups, support, and everything would also grow. I guess that's kind of what I hope for.
I think it's also important that, in 10 years, we have the Generation Z that I was just speaking about. They have lived through so many different types of trauma right now, and they're fired up. It's a lot of people that are just fired up because they just realize that racism never left right now since the recent murders. But these people have been traumatized their entire life. They went through all these school shootings recently. Of course, there were more before that, but the school shootings, war, H1N1, COVID, marriage, the same gender marriage being passed, like all these things, and seeing all these things play out is so many parts of history that they're alive during. My generation wasn't like that. Were there things? Absolutely, but so they're living traumatized. They've lived through so many different types of trauma. They're ready. They're ready, like, what is the next thing? Let's go. So I feel energized from them. Even in Idaho, we have lots of queer community organizers that aren't just organizing for the queer community. Nisha Newton has done so much for the queer community, and they just recently graduated college with an undergraduate. So these are young folks that's doing this work free, unfortunately free, that are ready, and they're getting other young folks to join. So I think young people are helping the generations before them, and will make the generations after them even better than before.
Yeah.
Kind of building off of that, do you think the marketing standpoint that Boise has as the best place to live or the most livable city in Idaho comes from the aspects of like white flight happening now to Idaho, since Idaho is a predominantly white state by demographics?
I have no evidence exactly of this, but the whole California thing, a lot of the people are leaving the liberal California, or this is a generalization, anyone can prove me wrong, because they want to be in a more conservative place. So that's where not all of them, of course, where some of that has happened, because it's California is in a lot of ways more progressive and has led the way on certain things. And if they don't agree with that, then they want to move somewhere else. And so there is some of that. I think some of it is people wanting to escape or leave bigger cities and bigger places and more crowds and that kind of thing. There's so many factors I think that go into it. I came here for the job, so it's that was my motivation. But I think that's it's so hard to pinpoint, and you have to look back so far. And I will say, as a little bit of a side note, the whole Idaho, Iowa thing too, I have actually found something from the 1940s where someone mixed up Idaho and Iowa. So like there's, this whole, suddenly people are learning that Idaho exists and are like, oh, there's mountains, there's trees, there's all this other stuff. It looks like a great, and getting consistently, one of the most bikeable cities, one of this and this and this, and great place for young people and this and that. And, I don't know, I take all of it with a grain of salt too. Yeah. But, growth is good and bad, and it's a lot of growing pains. And I think only time will tell how it'll turn out.
My short answer to that question about white flight is yes. I do think if I was a white person looking to be around more like-minded white people, Idaho is the place to be. I don't think that's a good or bad thing for that person to want that. whatever floats your boat, that's great. I think that a lot of focus has always been placed on uh, being diverse. And in a place where it's 93% white, 1.1% Latinx, 0.9% Black, 1.7% Indigenous, it's very difficult to focus on diversity and race because we would have to force people to move here for it to be a diverse place. Because of that, because diversity cannot be forced, the things that can be forced and can be intentional are equity, inclusion, and justice. So I think, if that continues to happen here at a faster pace, because it's happening really slow, then we move about 18 steps back, and then we kind of move forward, and then it kind of goes back. Eventually, it might not just be a paid place for white flight. Somebody else mentioned that people come here for the jobs. Audrey, you're absolutely right. I think, again, I didn't know about Idaho until my wife was recruited to work at Boise State. I had no, I Googled Idaho, and again, it matters where you Google Idaho from because the first thing that came up for me was Aryan Nation. So location, nothing came up for me. It said the city of trees, and then when I landed, all I saw was dirt. I'm like, well, that wasn't, accurate. But I know it's mountains here now. But it depends on where you're researching from because Aryan Nation, Coeur d'Alene was the first thing that came up. When I Googled Coeur d'Alene when I got here, it showed beautiful pictures. And say I had to go to like the third or fourth page on Google to learn about the Aryan Nation and to learn that Idaho has the most hate groups in America still. So these are white flight. Yes, I don't think that. I think some people come here just for conservative because it's a conservative state. But most conservative states usually come with a large predominance of white people. And then someone asked, can someone speak to creating supportive environments for the queer community and other minority groups at predominantly white students? Yes. So there are things at Boise State. So the Gender Equity Center is that's really one of the only groups I tend to work with at Boise State because they've been consistently inclusive. To create something at Boise State is very, because it's not a lot of things there. They do have a multicultural student services center and a diversity center. I think they might all be in one, so don't quote me on that. I always get confused. So there are groups there. There's the Black Student Union. There are different things there. And what is not there, you can create certain groups. Now, where the group has support is something different. There are small groups that Boise State students have put together. Financial support is something different, and I think that will look even more different because of the legislature passing the anti-affirmative action bill. Again, this is one of those bills where I think nobody decided to do the reading involved in the bill. A lot of people think anti-affirmative action has something to do with Black people getting jobs over white people. Realistically, anti-affirmative action has historically helped more cisgender white women than any other group of people in Idaho. So with this anti-affirmative action bill, that's basically kind of saying you can show no preferences to special groups in state institutions, which would be something like Boise State. A special group could be veterans, but I'm sure they won't be touched. So the bill, again, was to hurt marginalized groups. So I think even though the intention was to hurt marginalized groups, it's hurting other groups that wasn't intended to hurt. So I think support like that will, from the school, like it won't be a school organization. I think it'll be a little bit more difficult now than it was before because that bill goes into effect July 1. But students will be able to get together and do things without saying it's a Boise State specific group. So if you know somebody's interested, TCC is willing to help and provide space if necessary.
I will say too, with the Gender Equity Center, it was only 4 or 5 years ago that it was known as the Women's Center. So it started as that, and then they changed to, because it wasn't just about women anymore from when it first started, that they wanted to do that. And I know we're running out of time, but I do want to jump to the other question if I can, about yeah, because I think it's such an interesting one about the Boys of Boise atmosphere and the politicians. And I really want to go off this call and start researching that because I don't know the answer. And I think that's really interesting. You know, in the 50s, it would have been right after that. Frank Church was elected senator, and he was a Democrat. Cecil Andrus was our last Democratic governor, and his office ended in 95, his second 2 terms. And so it was so much back then. It was less about partisanship. I mean, there was always some of that, but it was a different world. And now I want to go interview all those politicians to find out how that would have affected them, and because I don't know the answer. And I think it's a really good question, because that then feeds into, it wasn't just about at that time, but going forward, and what politicians influenced other politicians and into different ways. And yeah, please come research that, because I want to know.
And I think that's another important note to pull away is history is still happening. There's always more to learn from history, as well as context does matter. So while Boise might have been small in the time frame, like, because it is small, events like that can have a larger impact on Boise history specifically, whereas on a national scale, it might not really have as much of an impact.
Yeah, and I think the context, and I think that's really key, because Boys of Boise, those kinds of things were happening all across the country. So Boise is still part of the narrative. So you can look at it just what happened in Boise and how people reacted and what happened. But it is important to look at the national and other places. Was it happening in Portland? Was it happening in other towns? Salt Lake City, Seattle, other places around here. What did it look like in the Northwest? What did it look like in the West? What did it look like nationally? Because that helped feed the conversation and understanding. To get the comprehensive view.
And we are unfortunately out of time, but I did want to say thank you to everyone that attended, but also both of you for taking time to join us tonight and help with this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. Happy to be here, and thank you to everyone who came.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Have a great night, everyone.
All right,
Yeah.
bye.